With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Horpedahl.
Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl joining us on Horpedahl. As you're well aware, I'm sure, because you teach students, a lot of people don't really pay attention to economics, but one economic number they always pay attention to, you just mentioned it, when they consume goods, when they have to pay for goods. That means inflation, that means gas prices. Those are the two things that consistently break through. Just turn the noise down for us for a minute. What are you looking at when you look at the buzzwords of inflation and gas prices in the social media realm or the news realm? What are you looking at, and what are you trying to tell people, like, okay, that's the term, and yes, this is happening, but here's what we actually need to be dealing with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's obviously a lot of talk about inflation right now. Everyone's feeling it in lots of different ways. When you see a number such as the Consumer Price Index, which is the most commonly used measure of inflation that is used out there, both in the media and often by economists as well, a number like that I think is useful as a first cut at how are things right now? How might inflation now compared to a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 10 years ago? But I think it's always useful to kind of drill down into that number and to see what's causing it, right? So if the price of, we say that the Consumer Price Index is up 8.5% or so over the past year. What does that mean? Does that mean everything's up 8.5%? Well, no, it does not. Some things are up more than that, right? If you look at the price of a lot of different kinds of meat, they're up 15 to 20%. But other things might be going up not quite as fast. So if we're thinking about how does inflation affect a typical person or a typical household, we need to know what sorts of things is that household consuming. And everyone doesn't have the same consumption pattern, right? If we look at, say, my industry, college tuition, right? This is a number people follow a lot. Well, most people aren't paying college tuition for, 40 years, right? People are paying college tuition for 5 or 6 years, or if they go to grad school, maybe up to 10 years. They might be paying off the student loans from those, over a longer period of time. But for most people, what happened to the price of college tuition last month is not really relevant to their budget, right? So we want to know what sorts of numbers are relevant. Certainly the price of housing is relevant, right? For most households, this is going to be 20, 30, or 40% of their budget's going to go to housing. Again, housing is so varied across this country, both in how much it costs and how much it's increasing, right? Some markets are really hot now and prices might be up 40 or 50% compared to before the pandemic. Others have seen more mild increases, but we want to know how's that affecting people's budgets? How does that relate to, importantly, how much have their wages gone up? This is the other important thing to remember about inflation is that, well, yes, prices are going up, but if your wages are going up just as much, it's not as much of a burden on you. But if your wages aren't going up as fast as inflation, that's what really matters to you, right? I mean, let's say inflation was 100% every year. Now, that would seem crazy and a totally different reality from where we are now. But if your wages were going up 200% every year, for you as a worker who's seeing those wage increases, 100% inflation is no big deal if your wages are doing better than that. But even at just a mild rate of inflation, 5%, if your wages are only going up 1%, then that really does hurt you. So we need to compare these two things. And we need to think about how does it look for whatever type of household we want to analyze, whether it's millennials, they're just kind of getting into the workforce, buying their first home, whether it's the boomers who are just getting into retirement, or the next generation, Gen Z, or whatever we're going to eventually call them, that are just graduating from college. I teach college, and we just had our graduation on Saturday, and you've got a couple thousand kids that are now being kind of dumped into the workforce. How are they going to do? We want to know all the prices that matter to each of those different types of households is very different. So one number like the CPI is a useful one to look at, but it should never be kind of the final word of what's going on with inflation.
Yeah, and another one of those numbers, Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl, an economist joining us on Horpedahl, another one of those numbers that it gets a lot of play in the media, but it affects people greatly. It really helps some folks. It's really going to hurt other folks. Talk about interest rates for just a second, because that's a number. Some people are going to love that it's going up. I know a lot of economists have been almost screaming that it needs to go up, but that also greatly affects a lot of people in very, very real day-to-day, almost week-to-week, every paycheck kind of ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about interest rates, we always have to realize, just like prices, there are lots of different interest rates, right? So there's an interest rate that you might earn from a savings account. Now that's very low today. There's interest rates you're going to pay, such as an interest rate on buying a new house, right? If you buy a new house today, the interest rate you're going to pay is very much higher than it would have been if you bought a house a year ago. But there's also interest rates that the Federal Reserve Bank is going to loan money to banks at, sometimes on a very short-term basis. So that's actually a key interest rate, what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing with the interest rate that they are going to be setting in markets for banks essentially lending money to each other. As that interest rate changes, as they increase that interest rate, that's going to have effects that are going to go across the economy, right? So as the Fed starts raising interest rates that they set, that's going to affect things like mortgage rates, and it's going to affect things like how much you're going to be paid on a savings account. So we need to think about, why is the Fed doing this, right? And as you said, why are some economists finally cheering that they're doing this? The reason for that is one of the main policy tools the Federal Reserve Bank has to get inflation down, now that inflation is kind of out of control, is to raise that interest rate. That's one of the main ways they have of impacting the economy. It's not the only way they have, and there's other things Congress could potentially do. But as far as the Federal Reserve Bank, that's the main thing they're going to do to try to both, when you're in a slow economy, they're going to lower that interest rate to try to speed up the economy in a sense. But when prices start going up, they're going to then raise that interest rate to try to slow down the rate of money growth, which then should slow down how much prices are going up. But it's a very, kind of challenging thing to do. There's a kind of a long lag between when they change interest rates and when it'll actually affect prices. It's not an instantaneous thing, even though it might instantaneously affect mortgage rates. So these two things, you mentioned interest rates, it's very much connected to the prices we were just talking about earlier.
Yeah, talking to Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl, an economist out at the University of Central Arkansas in beautiful Conway, Arkansas. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to drill down on one of those prices, gas prices, and some things that have been going on both in the administrative and in the social discussion field about how those things work. Also want to talk to him about those college kids getting ready to come out, because we do that every year and we don't talk about them enough. More economics with our friend Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl right after this on Heard Tell.
Now let me see you go off like a bomb.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. We are talking economics. Our friend Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl is going to explain some of this big number, big math stuff to me like I'm 5, so even I can understand it. Here's one that folks get wrong a lot, even though they're invested in it, because it hits them directly daily. Gas prices. You've been doing some writing about this in Real Clear Policy. Real quick, though, just so we have our nomenclature right, we talk about it, but break it down. What actually affects gas prices? Why is that what we call a lagging indicator? No, it doesn't. Just what happened today doesn't show up at the pump tomorrow. This is stuff from 6 months ago, year ago, 18 months ago. Just real quick in a nutshell so that we have the right terminology. What is gas prices actually reflecting?
Yeah, that's a really important thing to think about, right? Like, where does this number come from? We see it at the pump, right? We don't, and not just at the pump, we see it as we drive by a gas station, right? It's posted everywhere, right? So everyone's very keenly aware of this, and it certainly affects people's budgets. Economists, of course, love to talk about supply and demand, right? And I think that both of those factors are important here. Number one is there is, coming out of the pandemic, as most countries are now, there's a huge increase in demand for all sorts of things, but especially for traveling, right? Both by car, by airplane. And those are two industries which are going to be purchasing a lot of gasoline. It's necessary for them to have those moving forward, of course. So what that means is that part of what's going on is that people are just wanting to buy a lot more. But that's also hitting up to the other half of it that economists like to talk about, and that is the supply, right? So there's the supply of gasoline, which is certainly being affected by the events in Ukraine, as well as countries reacting to that war by either embargoing Russian imports or other things related to that. So that's certainly a part of it. But gas prices had been going up long before that began, going up throughout most of last year of 2021. So what other factors might there be? And here's where I think the essay you mentioned I wrote for Real Clear Policy, really, I tried to explain this in a pretty simple way, is that, when you have this increase in demand, what we would normally expect for most markets is an increase in supply, right? As people demand more, the price goes up, and then there should be more oil put on the market, which eventually turns into more gasoline, and the prices then should come down, we should get back to some sort of equilibrium as that happens. But this doesn't happen instantaneously, right? You can't instantly just suddenly find more oil or create more gasoline. There's a long production process that's involved in both extracting the oil, finding new oil. Certainly when the price of oil goes up, there are reserves of oil that weren't profitable to extract before that now are. But again, there's a time lag. So what's been kind of building up in the past year as we've been coming out of the pandemic in the US and other countries are as well, is that we've had a big increase in demand, but the supply side takes a long time to catch up. And then in the middle of that is when you have the Ukraine war coming online, and then that just kind of really just topples it over, right? There's wherever we'd be getting the new supply from, there's now just less oil available in the entire global market, and so that just really then kind of right in February and March, prices just started skyrocketing, right? I think in a few weeks, prices at the pump went up by $1 a gallon, and it was just a really dramatic increase in a short amount of time. But that was the buildup of a lot of things which have been happening in this very weird economy we have right now, post-pandemic, or kind of still in the pandemic, that all that's kind of coming together, and then consumers end up seeing it at the pump, right? So I think maybe next we'll talk about what is there anything we can do about that, right? There's a lot of people suggesting things we can do, but that's kind of the basics of what I think is going on with that market right now.
Yeah, and you start talking about things like price control. We've seen some op-eds, we see some talking heads discussing it. We've even heard it from some of the White House staff folks. Not in that terminology, but that's what they're talking about when they're talking about manipulating the price. Here's the problem. We've seen this movie. We know about the gas shortages in the 70s. That got hung around Carter's neck. But the part of that story folks don't talk about is a lot of the mess that Carter was dealing with was actually Nixon instituted price controls on a whole bunch of stuff before him in the 60s. We have a history of this in the United States of America with price controls. You're the economist. You explain it to me. That history is not a good one, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So like you said, there have been some people that have been saying that, well, one thing we could do perhaps in some markets is institute price controls of various sorts to try to bring down certain prices like gasoline. The problem with that is that doesn't solve any of the problems. So all the problems I mentioned that are causing prices to go up, the price control doesn't solve any of those problems. So if we were to put in Congress were to wake up today and pass a law saying that the most you can charge for gasoline is whatever it was a year ago, right? Realizing different markets are different prices. Arkansas is different from California. But if Congress said you got to charge the prices that existed a year ago, what would that mean? Well, none of the underlying reality has changed about more people wanting gasoline, about the situation in Ukraine. What you're essentially doing is trying to mask the problem. But what that then creates is an additional problem, which is, like you mentioned, the 70s, you get shortages of goods like gasoline, meaning that there just is not enough available. What that price rising does, right? An important part of prices rising from an economist perspective is to make it so that people are going to use less where they can. Now, of course, we can never cut back 100%, but use less where we can. And it's going to try to get more oil on the market. If you put a cap on that, whether it's the retail price of gasoline, whether it's the price of oil, what that means is you're going to screw up the market trying to react to this, right? You're not going to tell consumers to stop using it, which is what the higher price tells consumers to do. And you're not going to encourage more producers to put more oil or gasoline on the market. And you're going to create this additional problem of shortages, which would mean what we would see at the pump is not high prices, but what we would see is long lines. We would see people lined up because there's stations run out of gasoline and you don't want to not have gasoline. I mean, imagine today, the challenge with electric cars is doing a cross-country trip, right? For short trips, electric cars are actually really good, but am I going to find a charging station if I'm trying to do a 400-mile trip? If you have shortages of gasoline, it's actually the same problem.
Yeah, and we're seeing it now. Xin Yuan Quek is joining us down from Australia. We're seeing this a little bit out of the Russia situation where they're getting sanctioned. Uh, what happens with these autocratic dictatorial regimes is because of the corruption, because it's a dictatorship, it stifles innovation, it stifles creative freedom. So somewhere like Russia, we found out now once they start putting sanctions on, the system collapses pretty quickly because it's all cronyism. It's not really a bottom up innovative society. How much does government pressure or a dictatorial pressure in these cases talk about how that affects wealth generation? Because it'll affect a lot of wealth for a very, very small amount of people, but it's because the system is just funneling money. It's not actually generating wealth in the way like an America does, or like the England and Europe of the last century did. These places where we've seen great, Japan of the last 60, 70 years, Germany post World War II, these places that really explode in economic growth and economic freedom. You're not getting that in a dictatorship or an autocratic society because you just can't, can you?
No, you just can't. And I think a really good example is China. In the Mao Zedong era, there was a cultural leap, and it actually ended in a huge massacre of innocent lives, and that's because of dictatorship. So China only started to become become an economic powerhouse when they started embracing parts of capitalism. And who knows how much they can achieve if they fully embrace the free market. But in recent news, we can see that the current president Xi Jinping, he is looking to tighten reins. He's hunting down on the wealthy, the affluent, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see China experiencing what they experienced during Mao Zedong's era.
Now, the thing with China is they've got a built-in advantage on the world economic stage that's letting them kind of be the exception to the rule about that, is because they have a workforce of 750 million people. They have a workforce of 750 million people, excuse me, that are, for all extensive purposes, pretty much under government control. They can control where they work, where they put their industry, these things. And that has been the real secret to the economic might of China. And I don't think people talk about it, that a lot of it's just a sheer math problem of like, hey, we've got the biggest workforce in the world, and we also have complete and total control of that workforce.
Yes, and it is simply quite. I think China itself is a very interesting topic, but at the same time, I do think that if the president of China were to carry out even more restrictive policies, it will the sheer mass of the country will not be able to help the economic progress. And I think we can see that from history. During Mao Zedong's era, there were a lot of people as well, but they were still living in poverty. And when you look up a lot of when you look up people who have survived the Cultural Revolution, you will find that they have learned to embrace capitalism in Western countries, and it doesn't help that that China is taking a step towards capitalism, because they understand that it is only a matter of time before things go back to the way they were.
Yeah, talking to our friend Quack over in Australia. Why is it? I know we talk about the human rights issues China has currently today, and we understand that their economic might is buying their excuses and enabling them to do that, because people don't want to, they don't want to break up the cash cow that China is. Why isn't something, you talked about the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward is quite possibly the greatest single human caused disaster and extinction of people and life in the history of the world. And we don't really talk about that much. I know China censors that's a lot of it, but you're just talking about 20, 25 million people starving to death basically on purpose. Why do you think that's not more in our collective consciousness as the world, especially in the West, where we're usually pretty good with stuff like human rights, but we just never talk about the Great Leap Forward? And this is one of the most horrific things in all of human history.
I think perhaps a lot of countries don't want to jeopardize their economic ties with China, because they understand that even just by the sheer mass of the country, it'll be quite difficult for any countries to address this without triggering China. I think it was really interesting because I read an interesting article by the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, and he basically gave an in-depth analysis on trade ties between Singapore, the US, and China. And what he really strives for is the perfect balance between not agitating China while maintaining good ties with the States. And I think perhaps a lot of world leaders all over the world are trying to do the same thing. And while this does make sense economically, it doesn't do anything to address the problems that China faces.
Yeah, talking to our friend Quack from over in Australia. We're going to take a quick break. We come back on Heard Tell. We're going to continue to talk about poverty and wealth generation, a little economics. Going to take a look at it from the perspective of immigration. Two things that are always tied together is economics and immigration. We'll talk about that right after the break on Heard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're having a great talk with our friend Xin Yuan Quek from down in Australia. She's originally from Singapore, though, and that's kind of where we want to go with this conversation about economics and wealth generation and poverty. There's just no way to talk about the world economic story and not talk about immigration, especially Western countries. You're living in Australia, which was a completely immigration other than the Aboriginal peoples. Heavy immigration. America, of course, is one of the great immigrant stories in all of human history. Why is it, just for people to understand, because immigration brings certain people's priors and they get their backs up a little bit, why is immigration and economics so inexorably linked together?
I think if when you look back at countries that are incredibly wealthy, you think of Australia, you think of Hong Kong, the States, of course, and Singapore. And these countries are built by, these countries' wealth created by immigrants, by allowing immigrants to come in and be productive. So I think the most common misconception of immigration is that people strongly believe in the zero-sum theory, but that's not true. They believe, there's a lot of people who are against immigration believe that once immigrants come in, they're going to take the locals' jobs, but they don't. And you can see that you can tell that immigrants in fact boost productivity and economic growth. When you look at examples of businessmen who come from a different country, wanting to start their business in your country, and that's when they bring about new jobs. My favorite example is this founder of a hot pot company from China, Horpedahl. Some of you may have heard of it. Once he made it in China, he decided to migrate to Singapore So now he's a Singaporean citizen. And while many are not quite receptive to immigrants coming, they cannot deny the fact that this businessman coming to Singapore drives business to Singapore. And it in turn creates jobs for Singaporeans. And this in turn boosts productivity, lowers unemployment rate, and keeps us all happy.
Yeah, here in the States, because of COVID, we have this really weird economic thing we've been talking about with our economic friends when they come on the program of we have a really low unemployment rate and we have a labor shortage, which doesn't make sense in traditional economics. But then part of the story of that is when you go look at the data from the last 2.5 years, immigration has pretty much stopped from a dead standstill, some of it from COVID, some of it from other reasons. And boy, howdy, wouldn't you know that those gap numbers almost dead line up with the immigration that stopped. And people, I think, maybe didn't realize that, oh, there's certain jobs that the immigrant classes come in and they fill these jobs and just nobody else is doing them. That really was a thing. And when COVID hit, all of a sudden people found that out.
That is an unfortunate reality. I think the States. I think the States was once a vibrant place for. I think the States was once very open to immigration, but that's not the case anymore. And it's the same in Australia. There are a lot of policies regarding immigration that really deter immigrants, foreign workers from being productive. And I think an example from Australia is that at one point, because of COVID, the Australian borders were not open to those on bridging visas. And bridging visas is a type of visa that you receive when you've applied for a work visa in Australia. So because a lot of these work visa applications have not been approved, a lot of people were working in Australia under a bridging visa, and because of the COVID, they went home. And when the government didn't allow these people to come back in, they saw they witnessed the disastrous outcome, which is that they didn't realize the aged care sector actually comprised mainly of foreign workers. So when this happened, the aged care sector lost a lot of its staff and employees, and this resulted in deaths that could have been prevented. But because of the government's rigid immigration policies, I think we're beginning to see the economic consequences.
Why do people, talking to our friend Quack, people just talk about immigrations with like borders and people coming and going? Really, the conversation with immigration, especially legal immigration, we're not talking about illegal immigration, which everybody agrees that you shouldn't have that. You have to have, standards. You got to have ways. But when you're talking legal immigration, the part that has to be cohesive is some kind of a program, whether it's a visa program, a green card program, a sponsorship program, however you're going to do it. They have to have jobs and they have to have inroads into the economy, or the immigration is not going to work properly as far as economic development goes. You have countries like Australia, which are extremely restrictive with their visas. The EU is getting very restricted with their visas. We noticed the problem with the refugees with the Ukrainians is they're arguing over whether or not, do they get a 90-day work permit or do they get a 2-year work exemption? Things like that's the discussion you have. Why in people's minds do they not put those two things together when really that should be the conversation when you're talking about legal immigration, of not just the numbers you're letting in, but who you're letting in, which kind of skilled labor, which kind of skilled professionals, and how to get them into the workforce in a permanent way and fast track that process, because that's really what determines whether or not immigration is successful or not, more than the other factors, doesn't it?
I think there are two possibilities. I think when policymakers come up with immigration policies that do not account for short-term, medium-term, long-term effects, you can wonder to yourself, are they actually that short-sighted, or do they simply just not want immigration? I think that's the biggest question, and we'll never know because, well, we're not the governments, but I think that is a question that a lot of people need to think about. Government policies are usually reflective of their audience, which is us, the citizens. So it could be due to general consensus in the public, or it could just be like a big conspiracy. I think that's a really, really big topic.
Since we're talking prices, let's talk supply side for just a second. I was sitting behind a train yesterday. I was watching all those containers go by, the double stacked on the train. We talked a lot about supply side stuff. We talked about a supply side inflationary curve back during the pandemic. We're moved on from that a little bit. What's the data saying about that? Is that lingering into what's going on now, or did it wash out and now we're dealing with more of the oncoming traffic, as you said, as opposed to the rear ending part?
So we still have supply chain issues that are still driving up some of these challenges. We can still see that the price of a lumber is exceedingly elevated. And we know the price of some stuff coming from Asia is still elevated, and we still have backlogs. So, the data that we're seeing is showing that those effects are mediating. They're getting, less bad over time, but they're not coming down as fast as we would hope. And this is part of the problem, and as we would want. And part of it is because this isn't, COVID was an international event. And as much as we want to criticize the US policy response under both Trump and Biden, and also the response of the American public, compared to a lot of other countries in the world, particularly in Asia, some of the Asian countries did great, but some of the Asian countries where we get a lot of our imports from, not so great. Take up of vaccines is not as good as what we have here. So it's getting better. It's getting better, but it's getting better slower than we would expect. Much like the cold that I had took a lot longer than I wanted for me to get over it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a fence quoted for my backyard, and they won't even quote you wood fencing right now. They said nobody can afford it anyway, and it would take us too long to get it, so we don't even bother quoting it right now. That's how bad the wood is.
I'm trying to build an addition, an ADU, accessory dwelling unit, on my property. And we're having the architect draw up the plans now. I'm not anticipating starting construction on that until maybe mid next year.
Wow. Yeah, it's a mess. Talking to Jericho Hill, our economist friend. Let's talk about one other item you mentioned in there and kind of skirted by it for just a second, though. Inflation and prices. Everybody thinks they're necessarily coupled together, but that's not exactly the truth. They're not exactly dead set together. Talk about the relationship there with the prices a consumer sees on the shelves and inflation, because there is some lag there. There's some waves to those sorts of things. Talk about that, because everybody just assumes, well, inflation and prices, they're linked together. They go up and they go up. That's not exactly, it's a little more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think the nuance is it depends on what type of U.S. household you are. If you're a household that owns your home on a fixed rate mortgage, property price increase, property price appreciation, inflation, rent inflation doesn't really affect you, right? And that's a huge part of your budget. Now, if you're a renter or you're someone trying to buy and you have to buy because maybe you have to move to a city because you got a job there, right? That's going to weigh pretty heavily on you. That's going to be a pretty big impact on your budget. If you're, again, like we saw this for a long time, we talked about the used car market. If you were someone who couldn't afford a new car and you need to buy a used car, you were paying a lot of money for that. If you're someone whose household consumes lots of energy, maybe you have a lot of little rugrats running around, you're subject to a lot more inflation than, say, a childless couple, or a single person living at home, or just a couple with one kid. So these price changes affect people differently. You know, it also depends on where you shop. Like certain retailers are going to see higher price increases than others because of how they source their supply chains. So, you know, if you shop at Costco, maybe it's when you're in that demographic, you're not so affected. And I think that's sort of, you know, where we might lose track as policymakers up here in DC is we're in a particular kind of bubble. Most of us are homeowners. Most of us do buy from Costco. You know, most of us are fairly insulated from a lot of the costs that a lot of Americans outside of these big cities are dealing with. And we have to sort of keep that in mind. And I understand, you know, why there's some angst there and why there's desire to bring that back down. You know, again, the trade-off was, did you want to be working, right, and have a job and not be out of work? Or do we want to face these high prices? I would take the higher prices as a choice every day over leaving people long-term unemployed. And just, I think that destroys families far more than, you know, what I hope is, you know, maybe another year of dealing with price changes that are coming down but still elevated, and maybe we get back to normal next year, right? Yeah. If that's the choice that I'm happy with the temporary pain there.
Yeah, Jericho Hill, our economist friend, breaking this down so even I can understand it. We're going to take a quick break. We come back on Horpedahl. We'll get into more of this economic stuff. We'll get into the politics of it. It is an election year. I'm going to ask him a little bit of rapid fire, see what an economist thinks about some of the campaign lingo that we're going to be hearing over the next couple months. Jericho Hill on Horpedahl right after. Welcome back to Horpedahl. I'm Andrew Donaldson. That's Jericho Hill, our economist buddy, in the fancy dancy graphic print T-shirt, because that's what all the economists are wearing these days.
Let me bust out my tariff shirt sometime that we got Senator Orrin Hatch to wear. Scott Lennencombe would love it.
Yeah, the late Senator Orrin Hatch, God bless him. Mm-hmm. Great Twitter follow, by the way. I don't think his replacement will be nearly as fun.
No.
Let's talk economy for just a second. This is an election year, so I want to ask you a couple things. Since you're the economist and I'm not, I'm going to throw you some of the buzzwords we're going to hear, because let's be honest, this is the 8th or 9th most important election of my lifetime, to be followed by the 10th most important election of the lifetime next week. We hear the exact same.
I agree with you on that. I am with you 100%.
Yeah, we hear the same economic terminology every election. So I'm just going to ask you how they land with you when you hear them on a campaign ad. You're there in Northern Virginia, so I'm sure your airwaves are all campaign commercials right now. It's pretty brutal where I'm at. So let's hit a couple of these real quick.
But just be glad you're not in Georgia.
Our friend Jason Downey just had him on the program talking about it, and he said, you know, there is nothing but campaign ads right now. I was just talking to a radio buddy. He was like, yeah, I hate it. He's like, all my commercials on the radio station, but it's paying the bills. We paid the whole quarter off in one ad buy. Thank you, Club for Growth. Anyway, let's hit some of these items. Okay, when you hear a campaign talk about lower taxes, how does that hit your economic ears? Because a congressman, a senator, even a governor, they don't really have a whole lot of say over tax policy, but each and every one of them always campaign on tax policy. How does it hit your economic ears when you hear that on a commercial?
They can campaign on what their state and local locality can control, which is typically sales tax or property tax, right? Some states have income taxes, but not very many. You know, I would say we're dealing with inflation right now. So sort of the last thing we need to really do is to do a tax decrease, which will put more money back into the economy at a time we're trying to take money out of the economy and slow price growth. You know, I get it. I get wanting to have lower taxes for folks, especially folks that might be hurting. But right, that could backfire. That could send inflation up. But then again, maybe these governors don't care about that because the inflation is Biden's problem. It's not the governor's problem.
Yeah. Speaking of inflation, every election I've ever had, it is Reaganomics, the Clinton economy, the Bush economy, the Bush recession, the Obama recession. You see where I'm going with this. It's always like this, the Trump tax
Biden
cuts,
inflation.
Whatever. So now we're going to deal with the Biden economy, the Biden inflation. When you hear that terminology, because we hear it every election year, whoever's in the chair, they get blamed for the economy. How does that hit your economic ears?
A lot of what we're dealing with were things outside of our control in the country, because we were dealing with a worldwide pandemic. So it's somewhat unfair to pin it all on Biden's policies, but it's also fair to pin a bit of it on him. And I think, especially like, hey, they wanted to get a lot of money into the economy to basically make sure the unemployment got back to low levels that folks that we had. And that's the consequence. And so they made policy choices that created the inflation too, that helped bring it along. So they deserve part of the blame on this. Not all of it, but part of it. But hey, that's the breaks of being the guy in charge.
Another one that's the breaks of the guy in charge, because it is a lagging indicator no matter what anybody else tells you about gas prices. Now, obviously, there's a caveat to this one, because the president campaigned on reducing fossil fuels. That means they reduce output, they reduce planning. So that some of that is on him, but there was the war on Ukraine. That's going to crank things up. When you hear about gas prices and we're going to fix the gas prices, and the Biden did that stickers on all the gas pumps I keep seeing all over the place, how does that hit your economic years?
I mean, look, this is sort of the two-faced nature of politics, right? You said Biden, was, campaigning for cleaner energy. He was to sort of reduce our reliance on gas-powered cars and whatnot, and bring in more electrified vehicles. And that clearly was a policy choice. That would imply that we'd have less capacity for gas, and that would be an upward pressure on prices. And then, they also want to release a bunch of oil barrels from a strategic reserve to lessen that, which sort of goes against the policy choice. Again, like, maybe it's bad politics, but when you and I talk, like, I just feel like owning what your goal is, and stating clearly what the trade-offs are that you're going to get to the goal. So, hey, we want cleaner vehicles, we want a cleaner environment, we want to reduce our reliance on gas, we want to reduce our reliance on Russian energy. Good goals. Guess what? There are consequences to that. Yeah. Maybe 2/3 world phenomenon, 1/3 Biden's to blame. Like, he's got to own some of it.
Yeah.
I just wish that we could be more honest about this.
Yeah. Here's one that we need to be more honest about, that we talk about every single time. I'm going to bring back manufacturing jobs. Now, I always would love for one enterprising reporter to ask them when they're going to bring back tooling and ball bearings, because you're not having any manufacturing in the country until we bring those two things back. And we don't do those in America anymore, because you got to have that to have the bigger manufacturing. But when you hear manufacturing, that's a big thing in economics because of the indicators for it. It's something that America has declined in doing, and we import it more than we export it. How do you hear we're going to bring back those manufacturing jobs?
I mean, look, the developed world has moved those jobs to the developing world. That was a choice that made by pretty much every country. The leading edge industries are not manufacturing and will not be. Those are not manufacturers, not the driver of growth anymore. It used to be, but the world and the economy changed. I would hope that our policymakers, we want to keep the U.S. focused on delivering those drivers of economic growth to produce jobs, both high skill and low skill, down the line, in these emerging technologies, in these emerging, industries. That would be good policy. So, like, I get for the industrial workers in, say, West Virginia, right? You have, coal. Coal's not coming back. Like, auto manufacturing to like what it was in the 80s is not coming back. And politicians should just simply be honest about that. And we should work to sort of think about, how do we shift our job training? How do we shift our educational system to produce workers that'll thrive in that new economy? And thinking 10, 20 years down the road. Look, 20 years ago, I was working. I mean, you had your guests from the Board of Education. I was a student member of the Board of Regents of the state of Georgia. I was pushing for policies that would increase funding for our community colleges and small local colleges in Georgia, because their infrastructure, what they had available in the classrooms for students to learn, was just paltry. And that's where a lot of our, skilled jobs, not necessarily college educated, but skilled trade jobs, and whatnot, where folks would go to get their associate's degree or their training or their tradesmanship, and we weren't funding that, and we should. So yeah, let's think about what the world's going to look like in 10, 20 years, what these emerging technologies are, and figure out how to get those companies here, how to create them. Let's do what we should do. Let's waive the visa requirements for all the smart people from Russia, to get them to leave that country and come over here to the land of opportunity. Let's open up that can to everybody. And let's just bring the bright people over here. Let's bring the energetic and industrial people over and have them start companies, right? Immigrants start companies at rates far higher here in the US than native born folks do. And those are the folks that we want to have because they're going to create the jobs of the future.
Yeah, it's another topic for another day, something we're working on for a future episode. But that labor gap, it's almost identical to the drop in immigration over the last 2 years. Isn't it funny how that works out? Anyway, we'll talk about that in a future episode.
1 billion Americans, it unites both left pundits and right pundits.
Yeah, let's open that can of worms another day, shall we? All right, here, a couple more of these real quick, though, because it is campaign season. We hear the same things over and over and over again. Housing is starting to creep into campaign ads. I've actually seen some affordable housing ads. You never used to see those. I'm for it. But the problem here is who makes it affordable, because we all know when the government goes to make something affordable, it usually doesn't really end up being affordable. Let's talk a minute. It's something I know you spend a lot of time thinking and digging into, but I've actually seen a couple campaign ads. They ran one in West Virginia about they did a block grant for the whole state to get rid of blighted houses all at once because it makes it a lot cheaper to do, because you pay for 100 houses instead of 10. Smart policy, I think. So credit to them. But I'm actually seeing some housing policies show up in campaign ads. You wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago. How does that hit your economic years?
I mean, housing is the single biggest budget item in most families' budget. We should focus on that if we want families to be better off. So yes, I do a lot of work locally on trying to help expand housing supply. There's a lot of opportunities to do that. Here what we do is we like giving homeowners, property owners options. I live in an area where you can build a single family house. You can also build a duplex if you want, or a triplex. You can build a tiny home out back. We call that an ADU, or accessory dwelling unit. You could turn your basement into a grandma, suite, live in an apartment and rent that out. And those are options right there that I'm saying. Those are options that local governments can enact. They just require a zoning change, possibly, or just a little local policy change. But the local government doesn't expend any money to do it, and local governments are cash strapped. Other things that I've seen local governments do is they've said, look, we're not going to tell you how to build this new apartment complex, right? But if you want to have a 6-story complex rather than a 4-story complex, we'd like for you to put X number of units and designate them affordable based on our affordability guidelines. And then we'll give you the variance to build up higher. Local governments can't really fund this, right? They have to just basically provide the incentives for folks to do it on their own. And so I agree with Andrew. Like, we've had experience of look, we built Section 8 housing a long time ago in this country, right? And we concentrated low-income families into the same area. And that had consequences that were not good for those low-income families. And now we're seeing a lot more mixed-use planning and development, mixed income development, which based on the research, has better financial outcomes for those lower-income persons, better financial stability, better household stability. So, things that we can do for that, but it's not going to really come from a federal level, right? The federal government can't dictate zoning. That's a local thing. It's going to have to come from local folks saying, look, we want people who have lived in this area to continue to live here, right? And we need to help make that affordable, give them options. We want to have a diverse set of people, young and old, being able to live here. So we need to have a diverse set of housing options for them, and try to work change locally.
All the music on Horpedahl is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.